I'm very happy to see you at this panel, which is dedicated to the first days after deoccupation. This is the general name. We will be talking about how Ukrainian journalism can come back to the deoccupied territories, what awaits the journalists in those deoccupied territories. We've been trying to bring together the journalists with experience of coverage and activity in the occupied territories because Ukraine has two huge pieces of land, Kharkiv region and Donetsk region. Let me remind you that Lyman, Izum, Sviatohirsk, and others were deoccupied, and these regions already have some experience, some prior experience of deoccupation. We remember the conflict situations. We remember the experience of Kherson when there were conflicts between authorities and journalists who were trying to get through to Kherson in the first minutes of deoccupation and trying to explain what's happening there. So let's try and discuss all that. I think it's no secret to anyone that Ukraine is now actively developing deoccupation strategies. There is the resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers. Two regions are drafting special stabilization measures programs. Donetsk region, I know for a fact, has a big part on the on resumed activities of journalists in the occupied territories, and our task now is to provide some recommendations on what journalists can and cannot do, and how the cooperation between authorities can be improved. I suggest we organize this in the following way: 5 to 7 minutes of introduction. We also have our guest from the Balkans who can tell us how that had happened. This is a unique person. He has not only seen the Balkan experience, but also the Ukrainian experience, also while working in a humanitarian organization. So this will be very interesting. 5 to 7 minutes, everyone. Please tell us how you see the journalists' return to the occupied territories. What do journalists expect from deoccupied territories? What can journalists give to the deoccupied territories? Let's start with Olesia Vakulenko. She's representative of Suspilne. And let me remind you that Suspilne in Ukraine is the biggest network of TV channels that focuses a lot on regional broadcasts. Thank you very much. I'm very happy that we've already started this discussion, because preparing and understanding what we're going to do after the occupation, we need to start thinking now. We don't know when it happens, how it happens, but we have to be ready. I don't know whether we can expect anything per se in the occupied territories, but we can definitely get prepared. We have to understand what we can and we cannot do, and what we can and cannot offer to these territories, and how we can help them reintegrate in Ukraine. In the Ukrainian information space, Suspilne has a certain understanding of how to do that and what can be done right now. These are two big areas, creative and technical, and they are interrelated with the kind of contents that we can design for deoccupied territories and from deoccupied territories. When we're talking about the contents for deoccupied territories, this is something we can start doing already now. And this is what we already understand in the example of deoccupied territories, that people there are in complete information vacuum as to what is really happening in Ukraine. And one of the areas that we see is explaining to the people what happened in the world, what happened in Ukraine over the time of occupation. And then let me remind you that we're not only, having people for 1.5 years in occupation, but people who are in occupation since 2014. And they need a lot of explaining about things they may not know, they may not understand, and we have to realize that the Russians have been telling them things through their media, and this is going to be a huge piece of work ahead of us. And we have to have the understanding of how this contents may look like. We don't know what the Russians can leave behind after the occupation, but we presume it may entail full destruction of infrastructure. We do not know whether or not we're going to have a radio coverage, what kind of options we're going to have. So we have to be ready for different options. As to the contents that we may start developing for the occupied territories, with the vision and steps of Suspilne, first of all, we would see some kind of mobile teams with shorter fora that will be focused on registration of war crimes and things that happened during occupation to tell the world and tell Ukraine what the Russians were doing there. This should be contents about rebuilding, and we're not even always talking about rebuilding, physical rebuilding of the houses, but also rebuilding the networks that were ruined in some places, suspended in some places. We're talking about more global story and interaction between the people and the understanding as to how to restore communication between the people who were in the occupation and the people who have to understand what these people had been through, to make sure we don't stigmatize them and don't separate the people who went through occupation, to make sure we do not instill stereotypes about that. Thank you. The way I see it, we need to base on the fact that most probably we're going to have ruined territories after the occupation or the territories that suffered a lot. The experience of Lyman and Sviatohirsk are saying just that, experience of Izum. I'd like to address Konstantin Grigorenko, who is the editor-in-chief of Obry Izumshchiny newspaper, together with with the city. The newspaper has been through occupation, and I'm very happy that it restored itself. What did you have to face when you came back to your native town? Hello, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to see co-thinkers, colleagues from hyperlocal media who continue printing their publications today, and even those who are printing their publications while relocated. I'd like to show you what Izum residents have been reading over 6 months while our native Izum was in the temporary occupation. Clearly, the town did not have internet, television, radio, or newspapers. But the occupying forces have established newspapers very quickly. This is Kharkov Z, which was delivered to Izum and Kupiansk and was delivered to the local population with humanitarian aid. When I came back to Izum after the occupation and I asked them, where did you get information? Where were you getting your information from? They said, very easy. We learned information when we were queuing for humanitarian aid, or we came to the blog post and asked what is happening. Isolation is a very soft word. What do the occupiers do when they come to temporarily occupied territories? First thing they do is they take the brand of the local medium and they start printing their own publications. First printed usually, then audiovisual, or even television. Obry Izumshchiny is a very peculiar name. They have been counseling for a long time. They didn't understand what the word Obry means, which means horizon. They wanted to say horizons of Izumshchina, and that is how they would publish this. The only thing they stole from us is the logo of our newspaper, the silhouette of the town, and they started publishing their sort of war leaflet. The administration of Izum in Izum district, Izum Telegraph, They printed 11 of such publications between May and the occupation. And Krasnaya Zvezda Star is the um, newspaper of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, which was distributed not only among the Russian military in Izium, but also among the local population. On the 10th of September, my native town was liberated. 3 weeks later, I was in Izium already, even though there was no buses or railway. The military brought me back in. Most importantly, 1 week after the liberation, we managed to print the first issue. Most important thing is this photograph from the basement. The people who were in the occupation saw for the first time how our native town looks like. It was completely ruined. People did not know because they spent maximum of their time within the radius of 500 meters. They could not even cross the banks of Siversky Donets. So we had 5,000 copies of this, and there was a queue for that. They asked for Ukrpost. They were asking for, they were rejecting humanitarian aid, asking to take the newspaper. We did this thanks to the volunteers. The magazine was delivered directly to Izium, to the population directly. During the occupation, about 15,000 people were in complete isolation, like I said, and they did not have any news. And nevertheless, they waited. Among the peaceful population, there were people with critical thinking, and they found the way to listen to the Ukrainian radio. I have the opportunity to do this, and they probably have some kind of sense to criticize our state authorities, that I still have not seen the support of state institutions regarding the local, hyper-local media. And not just local media. Those people, those inhumans, created all this within 2 weeks. They seized the local radio station, Radio Izium, and they started broadcasting Radio Z on this wave. 1 year has passed. And up until now, not everyone can still see the Ukrainian TV in our town. Thank God there is Radio Promin and Radio Mayak, but there are no local media that would publish, except for Obri Izyumshchiny. We publish every week, we update our website, and even in 7 square meters that we got allocated, we are doing direct broadcasts with the leaders of communities. I would like to advise, particularly those colleagues who are living in the frontline areas, in the areas that are in the war zones. You have to have several options how you're going to cover the events that are happening in your territories. If our publication did not have multimedia options, did not have its own online website, now the SBU investigators would not have the facts that they do have at the moment. Basically, all names, all events were only covered by our medium. I'll remind you of one thing alone. When I was publishing on Obry.com.ua that the Metropolitan of Izyumsk and Kupiansk is a collaborator, that he blessed the military to kill, I got a call from Kiev, from a very high office, and they asked, Konstantin, are you sure? you've published this information, you realize that it's going to be published by all key resources. I said, well, I've been waiting for the confirmation for a very long time, but people have seen this with their own eyes, with their own ears, how that priest, so to speak, was saying that during the sermon. So I think we all need to think what kind of resources we can deliver to the deoccupied territories. People are not only waiting for sugar and flour and groats. They are also looking forward to information products, and this is our mission. Thank you. Thank you for your activities. Thank you for what you're doing for the town and for Ukraine. I'd like to give floor to Olena Leptuha, press secretary of SBU and Donetsk and Luhansk regions. What awaits us when we enter the deoccupied territories, when your colleagues are coming in together with the military, sometimes before the military, and when they start stabilization measures there? Because many journalists do not have a clear sense of what are stabilization measures. Hello? Yes, after the occupation, law enforcement officers, together with the prosecutor's office, with the National Guard of Ukraine, have some clear algorithms that they need to perform. For this beginning, when the territory is already deoccupied, liberated by the armed forces of Ukraine, the demining teams are coming in. The territory has to come the territory has to be demined. Only the armed forces can go before them, but we all understand what can happen after that. After that, the SBU, the border guards, the police are taking their stabilization and filtration measures. Apartment by apartment, house by house, survey of the territory, identification of possible collaborators, supporters of the enemy. We had cases in Lyman where we found in basements the representatives of the armed forces of Russia who were disguised as civilians but who were armed and who could be a threat to the civilian population of Lyman. The territory may also be partially mined. I have a big request to journalists. Please do not rush to visit the occupied territories. The way journalists are doing their work, the law enforcement agencies also must do their work. Please wait for a few days. Please let the security service of Ukraine, together with other law enforcement agencies and officers, to perform those stabilization filtration measures, to identify possible subversive groups, militants of illegal armed formations, Russian soldiers who failed to leave with their units. We had a case where one Russian was simply got drunk and he was left behind in the basement. So please stick to security rules, because the writing, the mark, press on your clothes is not a guarantee against finding yourself in the crossfire. And enemy attacks are always a relevant thing. Please adhere to security rules that were established in the order of the Chief Commander of the Armed Forces, order of the 3rd of March, 2022. You must not film the missiles that are flying, that are hitting something. Do not indicate coordinates. Do not film the faces of the soldiers unless the person has given its explicit consent. No number plates of armored vehicles or of military vehicles. This can be a very good information for the enemy, particularly for the central channels. For some reason, journalists forget these rules. We had a case in spring with a journalist of one of the central channels who filmed the work of artillery system HIMARS. She passed it on Instagram stories, and enemy missile flew in 2 hours later. HIMARS was luckily not there anymore. This is very, very important. Please remember that a journalist can be a potential target for the enemy. Your safety, your health, no story is worth your health and your life. The security service does not have any limitations unless, except for those that are, you know, um, the restrictions from the armed forces of Ukraine. But also, please do not rush to visit the deoccupied territories. Let us do our work. You will have plenty of time to do everything you need. Thank you. We also have Duga, chief editor-in-chief of Nakypilo Media Group, academician Olena Leptuha, particularly the war zones. And, it's also very important to get information from there for the society.
Знаєте, трошки інакше свій спіч, мабуть, побудую, тому що
probably I will build my speech in a slightly different way because Mr. Konstantino has brought up such an important subject as what people have seen under occupation, what they're expecting now. It's also an issue that the absence of any source of information gives people even more fear, because this incertitude, it just makes people freeze. In Izum, we filmed a report which was about a woman who was receiving some information from the radio, and it was a story that really shocked me, and she could spend her money to buy bread or to buy some food or batteries for that radio, FM radio, and she chose the latter because she wanted to know at least something about what was happening in free Ukraine. And of course, when we find ourselves in the deoccupied areas, we can run into some mistrust, because especially if we're talking about the regions that were occupied for 6 months, then evidently there is some kind of a lack of trust. Maybe many people could think about maybe that was going to last forever. Initially, people would not even be ready to share their comments or give some emotions, but they would be only able to tell us some more profound stories later. And this is primarily because their experience under occupation was so terrible that just tell everything to a journalist who has come down from Kiev or Kharkiv or from some other place makes it very difficult for them. So I think that here the role of hyper-local media, and I'm very grateful, Konstantin, for your work, because that would mean that local people would talk to journalists that they know. And I believe that yet another problem is a kind of invisibility of the smaller settlements, villages, and what happens there after the occupiers leave them. Well, of course, that's destruction. Before this panel, I looked up the news and I saw that the regional authorities reported that today, finally, electric power has been given back to Ruski Lozovit, which is a suburb of Kharkiv that was liberated on the 29th of April last year, and only now people finally have received lights. all this time they have had power with getting, they have had problems with getting electric power and getting information. So I hope that we will be paying attention not only to, sorry to say, settlements that are nice in terms of media, but to smaller ones as well, because there are people there, victims, and people who need information. Now, as regards what should be done, the question that Andrea asked, I think it's not enough to speak about the problems. We have to propose solutions. How we can help change the situation, what we can propose, those algorithms. Because we tell, who do we tell people about the problems? Who do we tell? People who already know about the problems. There was an example when a problem would appear and would be solved. I believe that constructive journalism can be useful to inform residents of the deoccupied territories. Thank you. And in order not to move too far away from that subject, that's a question to you, and it's a question for everyone in this audience. Why would journalists have to go to the deoccupied territories to tell some stories of the people, or to take out stories about crimes, to give them to the outer world? What is the primary task of a journalist who may face very serious individual danger, would go to deoccupied territories where only, a kilometer away hostilities can still continue? I believe that first and foremost, they go there to tell the others about what is happening there, or what has happened there. If we talk about the occupation of Kharkiv Oblast, let me remind you that it has not been liberated completely. And we now have serious and very grave battles and combat in Kupiansk area. And people who are still there are being evacuated now. And they have to tell everyone that it is dangerous to stay there, especially if you have children. I also believe that we have two vectors here. If we tell the others about the people who are there, then Ukraine and the world should know that. But I think that sometimes we forget about how we need to deliver information to those people, information about what is happening in free Ukraine and what they may expect when they go from their small village to other areas, whether they would find proper conditions there. Because what we often hear from people say, okay, if I go away, what will I do there? I have planted potatoes there. Do I have to abandon all that? What will I have if I move away? And I think that this question, what will I have later, whether I'll be able to find myself outside of my household, is very important, because some of these people have never left their districts, and they're scared because, once again, they think that the occupiers can come back perhaps and destroy everything, destroy their house, destroy their families. But you understand all that. You definitely have read all those stories. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Aleksander Anderson, a guest from the Balkans. He works at the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. Ukraine often speaks about the Balkan experience within the context of everything taking place in Ukraine. What I would like to ask you is whether what you had looks like what we have in Ukraine. And as this is a media forum, how did you deliver information during the Balkan conflict? Did you have those same problems when some territories would have no journalism at all, no information at all? And what kind of advice you can give to Ukrainian journalists in that sense?
Thanks very, very much, Andrei. I'd like actually to start by maybe taking a sort of step back and telling you some very vivid images that have stayed with me from international news coverage, international television news coverage from the last 2 years. The first one is the joyful scenes of the liberation of Kherson, the people greeting soldiers in the streets, coming out to celebrate, etc. And then the knowledge that those scenes were actually captured by journalists who didn't actually have permission to be there from the Ukrainian military, and that if they'd actually obeyed those rules, we wouldn't have actually seen that. And nevertheless, scenes which were incredibly sort of affirming, that have contributed to the continuing mobilizing of international opinion behind Ukraine. I think war also has this element of theater, and it's incredibly important. I'm mindful that in terms of my own country, my own original country, my first country, the United Kingdom, the generation of journalists who are covering this war in Ukraine is actually the same generation that covered Kosovo 25 years ago. And the same dynamic has pertained of mobilizing public opinion behind basically a necessary war effort through delivering truth, but that's it. And the other image that has unfortunately stuck with me is the polar opposite from recent weeks, and that's of President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, taking this deliberately lonely walk through the emptied streets of Stepanakert after the entire population had fled. And that flight of the Armenian population of Stepanakert, I think, was deliberately engineered through deliberate lack of reassuring messaging, through a food blockade that had lasted for months previously. So in that case, Azerbaijan decided to solve its national rebuilding problems by basically losing this problematic part of its population. Now, turning to my actual experience from both the Balkans and here in Ukraine, became very involved with critiquing the international administration and of Kosovo during the years after the liberation in 1999, not in Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, but as a researcher for the International Crisis Group. And later, I witnessed another deoccupation that was in Severodonetsk and northern Luhansk Oblast in 2014. Now, if we turn to Kosovo, those first weeks and months were characterized by a lot of murders, flight of minorities, Serbs, Roma, Ashkali, Egyptians, and this happening under the noses, really, of a vast international force of already numbering tens of thousands of troops. But what was missing was police, judiciary, courts, and it took a long, long time for these to be set up. In the meantime, the local media, which had managed to be revived, some of it with the help of international grants and assistance, too much of it was focusing on a sort of vigilante journalism, on pointing out people, neighborhoods, etc., that journalists, editors decided needed to be punished, and then their names and addresses were printed, and the international The international administrators tried to ban some of these newspapers, tried to do things like set up a temporary media council, tried to enact various forms of censorship. But the media kind of ecosystem that developed over that first year in Kosovo was such that, on the one hand, some media were attacking others, decrying them as traitors, Serbian spies, and so forth. And then even the more liberal newspaper ultimately defended the newspaper that the international administration tried to ban. So we had the whole sort of media society in Kosovo uniting against international censorship. So a very unfortunate initial few months that came from a lack of judiciary and policing, and we had this sort of problematic media ecosystem resulting, and ineffective attempts by the international administration to enact powers against it. The next theatre of deoccupation that I witnessed myself was Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Starobilsk, those places in northern Luhansk Oblast, in the immediate weeks after their liberation in summer 2014, after a dreadful period when Alexei Moscovoy and other separatist militias had controlled the place. There, and I appreciate, of course, that the Ukrainian state has advanced massively in the years between, that we have a far more coherent system of joined-up system of policing and military. But in that period, the local volunteer battalion was actually in conflict with the police, which it deemed collaborationist. It was in conflict with the local authorities. It kidnapped 2 successive mayors. And in the view of the police, the volunteer battalion was acting more or less like an organized crime group in the liberated area. The media, as such, comprised maybe some bloggers who were very much cheerleaders for the volunteer battalion. The whole impetus of Ukrainian journalism at that time was because of the desperate sort of state of security was to back the volunteer battalions, whatever. And then amid this, you had the OSCE mission, which was reporting the abuses, the extortions, the kidnappings, the murders, etc., that were happening back to Kiev, but were being censored by the OSCE monitoring mission headquarters. So it's actually a report that I produced for an international human rights organization that kind of brought attention to what was actually happening in this liberated area. So in both cases, a deficit or defect of policing and a consequent kind of off-kilter media ecosystem, local media ecosystem. So in both cases, Kosovo and what I witnessed in Severodonetsk, both have come out of horribly violent oppression, and had managed to cast off very oppressive forces. But in the period of deoccupation, that initial period of deoccupation, nevertheless themselves became slightly hermetic because of the nature of the authority that was controlling the deoccupied areas, which is something maybe slightly inevitable in Kosovo's case, the UN administration and the NATO forces. In Ukraine's case, at that stage, a government, and now a more comprehensive system of military administrations. And in that circumstances, I found myself in Kosovo, for example, when I was reporting for the International Crisis Group, quite often in this situation being an authoritative international voice, which was a lonely authoritative international voice amid a internationally controlled territory where that authority was used to dominating the narrative, was used to reporting back to capitals and being able to tell the story as it saw fit. And I found myself challenging that several times, and several times being called in by the UN administrator or the UN NATO general, sometimes to be shouted at or talked to, etc., because obviously our reporting was sometimes running counter to what the line they were reporting back to their capitals. It leads me to thinking about what is the right balance to strike for deoccupation journalism. On the one hand, we see a prevalence of vigilante journalism. I've just cited the cases of 2014 and Kosovo back in 1999 and 2000s. But we also see it now, for example, in Telegram channels that get to work in places like Kherson and others that invite people to shop or out people who they see as guilty of collaboration in one way or not, or even outing women who have had relations with, or alleged to have had relations with people from the occupying forces. Another different polarity of journalism for deoccupation is a sort of actively inquiring journalism with a lens of how do we build the future? What are the right questions to ask? For example, I see just in the Twitter feed of a very interesting North American journalist who lived in Severodonetsk for several years, just after I left there, who sort of looked at in the East which categories of officials ended up collaborating or not, and very much as it was a function of chance whether they'd been evacuated in time by Ukraine to be able to work in exile, or whether they'd been caught by rapid Russian advances. So officials from northern Luhansk, the rural areas, areas that had a more defined Ukrainian identity than maybe some of the urban areas in Luhansk Oblast, ended up falling into collaboration. Officials from cities like Severodonetsk or Kremina, for example, who were withdrawn in time, cities that did not have such a clear-cut pro-Ukrainian stance and had quite a lot of Russian sympathies within them. Those have actually functioned very well, and even their municipal leaders, who maybe a few years ago had clearly identifiable pro-Russian sympathies, have functioned well. So it's a function of the state and circumstances that seem to have a very great influence on what happens to people. And I think that brings us to the overall paradigm in which Ukrainian journalism and media are working now with regard to the whole issue of how to deal with the past in order to build a Ukrainian future in those deoccupied areas. I mean, with the laws passed against collaboration, against complicity with the aggressor back in, I think it was March 2022, we have systems that are very much like what happened in Western Europe after World War II, simply in circumstances where there's an overwhelming desire to bring to account those who cause harm to society, in circumstances where there is confidence that such justice can be pursued without risking stability, and in perhaps places like Kherson, where there is a minimal percentage of people who are involved in collaborative actions, that is true. But when one comes to areas like Luhansk Oblast, Donetsk, which have been leading a separate life for the last 10 years, it's going to be very, very different, of course. And I think a question arises, and this is also a question for media to be asking, is the model that we've got sufficient? Are the laws that we've got sufficient in order to ensure that we get something more akin to the scenes in Kherson when we eventually liberate them, and something less like the scenes in Stepanakert, which happened in recent weeks. And those other models are maybe ones that are piloted in places like Argentina, Chile, South Africa, the use of truth and reconciliation commissions in order to try to bring as much of the society as possible into a future Ukraine, in this case, or indeed even Spain, which opted for a policy of amnesia, though I can't imagine from a media perspective that has any possibility of acquiring legs.
Вы такой очень широкий контекст приводите, сравнивая Украину не только там с
You're giving us a very broad context as you compare Ukraine not only to the Balkans, but I'm very grateful to you for your experience and for those comparisons. But I understand it that Ukraine and Balkans are very similar in terms of, let's call it, unproportionally brutal treatment of the civilian population. That's the first thing that brings us together. And second, engagement of the media and the journalists into building those relations between the conflicting parties. Is my understanding correct?
Well, I have to say that the Balkans does not yet offer much reassurance in that, say, within countries, the media is very fragmented. For example, in Kosovo, you will have Albanian language media, which caters to the 90% Albanian majority. And then you will have media, a lot of it basically consumed from Belgrade by the Serb minority. And that media, it ends up with communities living in completely different worlds. There are uniting medias, such as Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, which is a network of 7 country organizations with a hub in Sarajevo, which reports across ethnic boundaries.
Да, спасибо большое. Я все-таки хочу вернуть вот этот вопрос, который я...
Thank you very much. I would still like to get back to the question that I put to Olena as to why journalists would have to go to the recently deoccupied territories. I would like to put this question to the audience. I'd like to hear the position of my colleagues. We have to go there to tell the world about what has happened in the occupied territories, or perhaps to tell the residents of those territories how Ukraine has changed in the meantime and how Ukraine is treating people who stayed there or people who didn't do anything illegal but just remained there as hostages. Maybe somebody in the audience would like to speak up. Yes, please. Good afternoon, Nakypilo Media Group. I believe that it's important to cover both aspects, and it's very important to explain to the people when we go there how Ukraine is changing, because very often, even when you go around Kharkiv Oblast, deoccupied Kharkiv Oblast, and they have been deoccupied for several months now, still people are concerned with how they should keep living and what they will do. And I think that here journalists can be and should be kind of intermediaries between these people and the authorities, because we want these people to live there, to see their future, and they want us to help them reintegrate in some way. And often when I have talked to the local residents, often it was a kind of an excuse where they would say, well, we haven't been enemies, we're not collaborators, we wanted Ukraine to come back. And I have often heard it, as a kind of excuses from their part, and as a kind of a fear that somebody would come to them and would blame them for having cooperated with the enemies just because they didn't want to leave their houses. And I think that within this context, it's important to explain to the people and to tell them about how the situation is changing, what the government is doing, what the state is doing. Because when you have no regional media, when there is no way to deliver information, you often see that the national programs are not really working because they're not explained to the people. And I think that this is a very important aspect. When you come there and when you can be useful for these people, because they have to live there. And if we as journalists have to deliver this information, I think that's an important aspect of our work. And incidentally, when we speak about collaborationism, I'd like to ask Helena, in general, what is the percentage? What is collaborationism? Is it a very well spread phenomenon? Because there are people who think that all those who have stayed in the occupied territories, they all are collaborators. All the people who are staying in the area of hostilities, there are people who are just waiting for this Ruski Mir, Russian world. Your experience of work in the occupied Donetsk region, what does it tell you? Is that correct? Well, I can tell you that I personally believe that it's a mistake. Definitely not all the people who are staying in the occupied territories are collaborators or people who aid and abet the enemy or who potential informers or who correct enemy fire. If a person has joined the occupational administration voluntarily, having agreed to take some managerial positions and or perform some managerial functions, that's definitely a collaborator, and criminal liability is waiting for that person. If that person has just cleaned the streets or guarded buildings or just tried to survive in some way, then the security service, if we have checked all that and if we understand that this person has not performed any criminal orders of the occupiers, has not helped them in their work, has not helped look for pro-Ukrainian people, then basically we would not have anything to blame them for. Moreover, there's a number of professions such as teachers, municipal people, or doctors who are protected even by Geneva Conventions. But once again, unless a person has on a voluntary basis agreed to, for example, start managing some administration or a healthcare center, that would be considered voluntary cooperation.
Is there any statistics as to the collaboration of the media representatives? For example, in Mariupol, there's a pretty widespread practice. Multiple well-known journalists from Mariupol, are now working and even teaching in the in the occupied universities. I do not have clear statistics right now on me. If you like, when we go back, I will definitely clarify that. But yes, of course, we have criminal proceedings at the moment. I have the press secretary of Donetsk prosecutor's office, I think she will be able to confirm that information regarding the journalists who are working for the occupying forces and who are propagating the ideas of what we call the Russian world. If they honor the participants of the aggressive war, if they create propaganda, then yes, they will be liable to criminal responsibility, and criminal proceedings against journalists are also in place. Thank you. I would like to emphasize, and this was discussed before, there are two categories of occupied territories. The long-term occupied territories and recently occupied territories. And we can see that even with the fact that Mariupol and Izium were occupied during pretty much the same time, the liberation is happening at different pace. And Izium was more lucky. The occupation lasted for 6 months. In Mariupol, the occupation continues. And the longer the time of the occupation, the fewer Ukrainian media will stay there, or at least the journalists who are even a little bit pro-Ukrainian sentiment. So my question for Olesia is this. Do the media representatives realize that, in fact, all right, we may be telling the stories from the liberated territories, but the media landscape of those territories will have to be built from scratch, essentially. And, perhaps there may be something left in Mariupol, but in Donetsk and Luhansk, this is not there. Everything is solidified. And Russian propaganda was working at full swing. Do your colleagues have the understanding that they need to not only inform, but also provide some assistance and perhaps work in some local media? As part of journalists who left Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea and the newly occupied territories, and even based on the conversations with my colleagues, I've heard that they're ready to return to Luhansk, to Donetsk. So there are people who are ready to go back and who are ready to work there. Obviously, now working in the occupation is impossible and physically dangerous. It's a life risk. Transferring information, collecting information is always a risk for the person who is doing that and who dares to transfer some information somewhere and somehow cooperate with the Ukrainian journalists. Speaking Ukrainian, corresponding with the Ukrainian numbers, this is a danger in itself. I also equally understand that there may be people out there, journalists out there, who will be ready to study this topic from scratch. And I think that when we're talking about occupied territories, the person who shows interest and wants to talk about this, I believe, can be involved and trained with certain criteria and how to talk about this and how to talk to people, what to talk about, what to emphasize, etc. I do not think we will have a shortage of journalists. I think there will be obviously some crisis because many people have left the country, many people have found their place in the media and the other media. Not everybody is psychologically ready to go back, but even from communication with my colleagues, I would repeat that there is a part of them who are ready to return, and we will definitely build capacities. We will not be able to return to Lugansk straight away and enroll the studio and make programs. This will take some time. This will be some mobile teams, small groups that will expand, who will develop more and more contents for the people, about the people who are there. But we need to understand already now how to talk to them. Because that hunger for knowledge in the newly deoccupied territories, which I felt when I was there in the occupation 2014, is not as strong as in those who have been in occupation since 2014. But nevertheless, even now, as we speak to the people who are staying behind, it doesn't mean that they're not looking forward to Ukraine. It doesn't mean that they don't want Ukrainian news. They wait, they want. There is a certain part of the people who understand what's going on, and they very much hope that Ukraine comes back so that they could move freely and feel free and find information freely. What do your readers want to read? And some people think that there should be a lot of contents and what it is that awaits for you in Izum in your experience. I may surprise you, but people are interested in reference material. Just some reference material, the schedule of buses, of railways, how do hospitals work, pension funds, and we continuously provide this information. There's a lot of deficit of information, there's a lot of demand for the information. It's a brand. for the fourth time now, we are printing the changes of the names of streets. When I say I live in the Steve Jobs Street, everybody starts laughing, including foreign journalists. I said, well, this used to be the Sako and Vansetti Street, and they laugh even harder. We're not war journalists, but we're writing this. I did the last interview with the widow of the killed Izium resident who was awarded by the president of Ukraine. And we had to stop several times in the course of this interview because we could not do it, calmly. And why we decided on this interview, it's a very interesting story. A neighbor called and said, that such and such person, Kvitko, was awarded with Bogdan Khmelnytsky order. And nobody knows. Why nobody knows? So that's how we met with his wife. She agreed. She said she agreed to, make it public. It shouldn't be like that. When I come to the military unit and they quietly give me this little box with a medal. And I shifted this to the local authorities, but I said, wait, I don't think the local authorities knew about this. It cannot be done so quietly. So there was a first, the first page. And the first call was from the military conscription unit. I said, they said, why did you put us in such a bad light? It wasn't me, I said, it was the widow who put you in this light. So we write about the deceased, about people who got killed. You probably know that there are mass graves in Izium with 470 Izium residents who were buried during the occupation. That includes the military, civilians, my friends, that I grew up with. This is a very difficult topic, and we're writing about this. We don't have any special experience. Where is that line, that ethical line? I don't know. But we're writing about this. We are writing about the prisoner of war who was in Mariupol and Azovstal, who was exchanged, who came back from the captivity, from being prisoner of war, and who is now back in front. We said, it's not for us. It's for the next generations. Any information particularly for the older generation, is useful. And we're trying to respond to all of those requests that we're receiving. Taras Shevchenko, deputy minister, was speaking at the panel there. And the national council, Aleksander Burmagin, also liked it very much, that they that they recognize this. They've all buried the printed press, but they recognize that the printed word comes first to the occupied territories. Then comes the radio, then comes the TV and internet providers. This is how it was, and this is how it will be, despite the fact that the costs of the publications are very high, much higher than radio or TV. But the newspapers were the first to be reborn. And today, the television, if you look at the deoccupied territories, newspapers and radio are living through a renaissance. I'm telling you this as a person who is living in deoccupied territories. In the past, I only used to listen to the radio in the car when I was going to and from work. But now I turn on the radio right after I wake up in the morning. And I think it happens in every house like that. And somebody was remembering that people were buying the batteries for huge money just to hear the Ukrainian radio. And this is how it was. And this is very precious. And I'm very grateful to those people who found this time. They were spreading the word that they heard from the Ukrainian sources. Thank you. This is very important. 1.5 hours of our conversation have passed, and I'd like to ask one simple question to each participant of the panel. What will be the first day after the occupation of Donetsk? You mean Donetsk, relative Donetsk, or physical Donetsk? No, the same Donetsk where with Donbass Arena, Universitetska Street, and relatives and places that are dear to our hearts and sensations that are dear to our hearts. I think the first day is going to be a mix of joy and understanding that we will come back there. Understanding that everyone will be able to see what is there, what they forgot, the possibility to remind ourselves what we forgot. The first days are not going to be like, that we all would be able to go. And Halina said this very well. We will only be able to go there when it's safe after some time. The key thing we need to consider today is safety, physical safety. And truly, first, the law enforcement, the military have to determine that only then can we come in and really talk to the people, to understand what they want to hear, and to understand what we can give them. As a person from Severodonetsk, I am really looking forward to the liberation of Severodonetsk. And I think on the first day, I will be, crazily happy that I finally have a home. I'm from Luhansk, and I'm looking forward to liberating Luhansk. It will be a very tense working day, or maybe this day will be a very tense 24 hours and very tense month or week. A lot of work, a lot of activities. This will be work, and work, but with a taste of joy for sure. Thank you, Olena. It seems to me that this will be the first day of overcoming stereotypes about one another. A lot of things have changed in the worldview over this time, and we can see that these iterations, in 2014, 2015, when a lot has been written about IDPs, if some kind of crime was done, it was the IDPs. Last year, it was pretty much the same about Kharkiv residents, and we were joking that, okay, Kharkiv is working through its karma now, just because. So this will be about meeting each other from the start, from the new, meeting each other anew. I believe we need to trust one another, because we've all had a different experience over this time. And this experience is worth sharing. I'm not idealizing this. I'm not idealizing that everyone will be happy to see each other. Not at all, but it's worth a try. Konstantin? Well, I don't presume there's going to be the Vyshivankas march in Donetsk, but the first thing that's going to happen is the Ukrainian flags and flags of Donetsk Shakhtar. And there will be loudspeakers with Ukrainian radio. Aleksander, for you, if possible, because everybody is tired and wants some informal communication. And we will discuss everything there.
I don't know. I hope it's not going to be the result of a grinding street-by-street fight that leaves you with a totally ghostly, deserted Donetsk. I hope it will be an entry that has elements of consensus about it. When NATO bombed Serbia and Kosovo to try and gain entry, it said it was bombing in order to get agreement from Serbia for an unopposed entry by NATO troops. At the time, I thought, good luck with that, but it happened. Anything can happen, and I think planning needs to be to include provision for that anything?
Дякую. Я хочу подякувати всім учасникам цього обговорення.
Thank you. I would like to thank all participants of this discussion. We were hoping to talk about practical things, but it turned into a worldview discussion. I would like to thank everyone for this very full day.